In the early 1800s, Alexander Campbell took a position which said religion cannot be reformed. He spoke specifically about revealed Christianity. Religious institutions, however, were another matter. In an important article series in the Christian Baptist, he wrote this: "All the famous reformations in history have rather been reformations of creeds and clergy than of religion. Since the New Testament was finished, it is fairly to be presumed that there cannot be any reformation of religion properly so called. Though called reformations of religion, they have always left religion where it was. Human creeds may be reformed and re-reformed, and be erroneous still, like their authors. But the inspired creed needs no reformation, being like its author infallible. The clergy too may be reformed from papistical opinions, grimaces, tricks, and dresses, to Protestant opinions and ceremonies. Protestant clergy may be reformed from Protestant to Presbyterial metaphysics and forms, and Presbyterian clergy may be reformed to independency, and yet the Pope remain in their heart." What Campbell was really saying is that real Christianity rests with the revealed Word of God and can't be reformed. Only organizations, institutions, and rituals can be reformed. Therefore, when Martin Luther nailed his challenge for debate to the door of the Wittenberg Chapel, he challenged Catholic abuses, practices, traditions, and rituals which had accumulated over centuries. Well, let's start out by looking at some of the contributing factors to the Reformation of the 16th century. By the 16th century, Europeans began questioning old values, traditions, and forms in the church and the day's broader culture. In the church, most priests were either immoral, corrupt, or illiterate. Luxury and ritual replaced genuine spirituality, and the average Christian became restive and dissatisfied. The times were really ripe for change. Where the general culture was ill-prepared for reform when Wycliffe and Huss called for change, it was really ready at the dawn of the 16th century. And here are several factors that set the stage for reform. First, the Renaissance. Renaissance scholars called for a return to the classics and the past. The cry often heard was ad fontes, to the fountainhead. Let's go back to the beginnings. Let's go back to the early norms. The Renaissance scholars refocused on ancient Greek literature while pointing the church to the New Testament and church fathers. When reform occurred, it called the church away from traditions back to the New Testament. Second, invention of movable type. Printing had come to the West from China and predated the Reformation. However, printing was expensive and took time to carve full pages of material for printing in wood. Next, printers carved individual letters. That facilitated the printing process, made it a little bit quicker. Wood block, however, proved flimsy in the printing process, and it was also expensive. Johann Gutenberg's invention of metal-faced type changed everything. Printing with metal-faced type reduced production costs and made books and pamphlets cheap and easily produced. Printing made Luther's revolt possible. Third, economics. Particularly in Germany, the people began to enjoy prosperity as the bourgeoisie class grew. Germany held fantastic mineral wealth which added to the German affluence. Craft guilds and secret societies, some of which were nothing more than disguised evangelical associations, multiplied across the land. Secret societies often called for societal changes such as a form of socialism and communal living were heard abroad in the country. Number 4, changing political structures. The Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire no longer held the power it once possessed. Parliaments were forming, as were national identities. European university campuses were rife with nationalistic spirit as groups formed based on common culture, values, and racial and language characteristics. 5, ecclesiastical corruption. I've mentioned this a little bit before. As the 16th century dawned, the Catholic Church still felt the effects of the Avignon period and the conciliar efforts that followed it. Corruption existed from priest to pope. Savonarola, an outspoken preacher of that period who died in 1498, said, "If you want to ruin your son, make him a priest." Simony, superstition, and stagnation marked the church. Number 6, gunpowder. The Chinese had invented gunpowder, and black powder made its way to Europe as a result of the Crusades and the opening of trade with the East. It is believed by many that national identities depended on gunpowder as it offered superior means of defense. And then number 7, and something we don't often consider. Now think about this. Luther's revolt began in 1517. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. And the discovery of new lands then distracted ecclesiastical leaders and European kings as the struggle to establish new colonies and to evangelize new peoples consumed a great deal of their time. Reform in Germany begins, of course, with Martin Luther. Martin Luther was born to a prosperous Eisleben, Saxony family in 1483. He began his education at home, but eventually enrolled in the University of Erfurt, where his father insisted that he study law. But Luther entered an Augustinian cloister as a monk. There's an interesting story that explains his decision to leave the university. No one really knows the truth of the story, but there are about 3 constants in each account. The 3 constants are Luther, lightning, and a friend. Roland Bainton, a well-known historian, particularly emphasizing the life of Luther, says lightning struck him to the ground, after which he cried out, Saint Anne, help me, and I will become a monk." The experience convinced Luther God called him to a religious life. His call to the cloistered life intensified an inner spiritual struggle. Luther felt unworthy to stand before God. He approached the celebration of his first Mass with fear and trepidation. In an attempt to feel pure, he fasted, made frequent and lengthy confessions, and adopted an austere lifestyle. But nothing really assuaged his spiritual anxiety. Nothing really settled his anxious spirit. Well, Luther finally buried himself in Scripture. In the process, he turned to Romans 1:17, and the light just dawned. The passage spoke of the righteousness of God. He found the same phrase in Romans chapter 3, verses 21 and 22. And as he read these verses, he realized it was not his personal righteousness which saved, but it was God's righteousness, exhibited through the death, burial, and resurrection of his Son, that saved him from his sins. His discovery led him to understand it was not perfection which earned him God's favor, but faith alone which brought an individual into fellowship with God. And from then on, sola fide, faith alone, became his watchword. Luther's education earned him an appointment to the new University of Wittenberg, where he fulfilled responsibilities in the Wittenberg Chapel. At the time, the Archbishop of Mainz needed to pay annates. To raise the necessary funds, the Pope was working to build St. Peter's at that time. The Pope permitted the Archbishop to sell indulgences. An indulgence is simply a means to reduce the temporal punishment for sins. Luther believed the practice was wrong, and when members of his parish brought indulgences from a nearby principality, Luther challenged the church leaders to debate. On October 31st, 1517, he nailed 95 theses he wanted to debate to the door of the Wittenberg Chapel. The chapel doors often served as a community bulletin board in those days, so this was nothing out of the ordinary. Luther firmly believed Pope Leo X was unaware of the sale of indulgences. He was wrong in that. Luther's objections got the attention of the Pope, and the Pope then sent Johann Eck to debate him in a disputation, or a debate. In Leipzig, During the debate, Eck pressed Luther into an admission the papacy was of human origin and a denial of papal infallibility. Those admissions earned Luther condemnation as a heretic. And on June 15, 1520, Pope Leo X excommunicated the reformer. When Luther received the bull of excommunication, a bull is from the Latin word bulla, it just simply means pronouncement. Luther burned the bull of excommunication. When he got it, he burned it. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, summoned Luther then to the imperial diet or parliament, guaranteeing safe conduct in the process. Luther decided to go in spite of pleas from friends and colleagues. He entered Worms, the site of the diet, April 16, 1521. The Diet Assembly ordered Luther to retract his writings. When he responded, he reputedly said, and this is somewhat of a legend, no one's really sure if he really said these words or not, but they're famous and they've come down to us today, and the words are, "Here I stand, I can do none else, God help me." The emperor refused to withdraw the safe conduct, and Luther left. The Diet issued the Edict of Worms naming Luther an outlaw, prohibiting his writings and destroying his books. And after Luther left Worms, horsemen appeared and secreted him away to Wartburg Castle, where he lived for a time under the watchful eye of Prince Frederick of Saxony, who was sympathetic to Luther and his views. Luther remained at Wartburg Castle for nearly a year, and during his stay, Luther translated the New Testament into the vernacular German. While at Wartburg, the revolution radicalized under the leadership of Melanchthon and Karlstadt, fellow professors at the university. Priests were getting married, monks were getting married, nuns were getting married, priests were giving wine to the laity, they were celebrating the Mass without their vestments, they were reciting portions of the Mass in German, and they continued Masses for the dead, all of this was unheard of at that time. Luther returned to Wittenberg on December 4, 1521, and reversed all of the more radical reforms and took a more moderate stance toward the revolution. Luther's revolt against the Catholic Church paralleled what was occurring in German society at that point. There were several people movements that arose demanding additional freedom for the lowly serfs. And these movements also radicalized with efforts to destroy property rights and institute a form of communal living. Violence led Luther to advise the princes to put down these revolts, and the nobility moved against the peasants, and at one point they had slaughtered nearly 100,000 people. Because of Luther's involvement, the lower classes rejected his reforms and returned to Catholicism. In time, political changes facilitated Luther's reform movement. The Diet of Spires, held in 1526, allowed each principality in the Holy Roman Empire to decide between Protestant and Catholic practices. When protests arose, the Edict of Worms was reinstituted, leaving the German princes to protest. It's this protest, the protest of the German princes against the edict, the restoration of the Edict of Worms, that leads to the term Protestant. Finally, Emperor Charles V called a diet at Augsburg to restore peace. Melanchthon, with Luther's approval, presented a creed. That creed we now know today as the Augsburg Confession of Faith. And Luther's followers were formally noted as separated from Catholicism. Now, an easy way to get a portrait of Martin Luther is in the 2003 PG-13 movie Luther, starring Joseph Fiennes. The director, I think, overplayed Luther's anxiety a bit, but it's worth seeing, and it can be seen for $2.99 on Amazon Video. Well, this leads us to the next of the great reformers, Ulrich Zwingli. Sometimes Zwingli is considered a second-rate reformer. Ulrich Zwingli left, and even at that, though, I should say, he left an indelible stamp on Reformed theology and non-Catholic Christianity. According to Dr. Jack Cottrell, Zwingli changed the traditional understanding of the purpose of baptism and taught what I believe, and I think many others believe, to be an erroneous covenant theology and doctrine concerning the purpose of baptism. At heart, it's my conviction that Zwingli was an immoral humanist masquerading as a Catholic priest prior to becoming a Protestant reformer. He was born to a magistrate's family in Wildhaus in 1484. He studied at Basel, and then at Bern, and then Vienna. He studied philosophy and medieval scholasticism before teaching himself theology and Greek. All the while, he was a good Catholic, and he began a ministry at the church in Glarus and then Einsiedeln, and Zwingli began to, at that point in Einsiedeln, to begin his transition from Catholic to Protestant. He had seen some of the Catholic abuses, such as the sale of indulgences, the veneration of saints and relics, and he didn't feel that those made much sense. So that helped contribute to his decision to convert. A move to Zurich in 1519 led to contact with a young woman. He got this young woman pregnant, and then he tried to justify his immorality by accusing her of coming from a family of low reputation. But when confronted, Zwingli admitted his fornication, which caused the Zurich church to retain him because of his honesty. Once settled in, Zwingli began preaching through the New Testament rather than using the church-approved program. City magistrates questioned Zwingli's teachings, proposing a debate again to discuss his theology. And then the first of two disputations or debates began on January 23rd in 1523. Zwingli prepared 67 propositions for that debate. Each of these propositions attacked Catholic dogma and practice. He claimed the right to preach Christ as sole mediator. He insisted on the Lord's Supper as a memorial, not a sacrifice. He preached that the Mass was idolatry, or that city magistrates, in spite of doubts, should rule over the church. And they accepted his views, the magistrates did, but they also went ahead to schedule a second disputation for October. This time there was no Catholic representative to debate, and he simply used his time to convince the city fathers to accept even more changes. He abolished the Mass altogether, put preaching in its place. He took the images out of the church. He took all musical instruments out of the church. He eliminated the altar and substituted a plain table in its place. He allowed all believers to partake of the loaf and the cup and placed more emphasis on the sermon. The city leaders simply went along with every suggested change at this point. Now, on the course site, I've posted 2 Christian Standard articles entitled The History of Baptism. These articles discuss the common understanding of baptism's purpose from the church's beginning to the Reformation. That's the first article. Then the second article shows how Zwingli changed its traditional meaning. Further information can be found in the book Baptism and the Remission of Sins, and Historical Perspective, edited by David Fletcher. Chapters 1 and 2 explain Zwingli's theological mistakes a little bit more fully. Zwingli also had more radical contemporaries among his followers. Those were known as the Anabaptists. Anabaptist leaders believed Zwingli's reforms were inconsistent and incomplete. Where Zwingli depended on magistrate support, the Anabaptists said there should be a strict separation of church and state. And they also rejected Zwingli's practice of continued infant baptism, believing that baptism should be for adults only. Now, we want to emphasize here that many of the Anabaptists continued to sprinkle for baptism, but in time they also transitioned from that to immersion. Frustrated by failure to bring Anabaptist leaders into line, Zwingli called for the city leaders to declare them subversive, and once the city leaders did that, persecution followed, with Felix Manz an outspoken Zwingli opponent, drowned in a mockery of baptism. Early Anabaptism is the beginning of the Mennonites, the Hutterites, and the Amish. There are some scholars who believe that the foundations for the Baptist church go back to the Anabaptists, but I don't believe that's the case. I think that there are other sources for the Baptist church as we know it today. Reform continued to permeate Swiss cities, but failed to capture the rural countryside. Urban cantons, or provinces, went to war with their rural Catholic neighbors twice. The rural cantons appealed to the Swiss Diet to order the reformers to cease their proselyting or preaching, traveling amongst those rural cantons. The Diet took their side, ordered reform innovations to cease, deposed Zwingli, and ordered Protestant scriptures confiscated and burned. Both sides, at that point, armed for war. But the first conflict ended in a treaty before the battles ever started. Reformers could not stay silent, though, and the threat of war raised its head once again, and conflict began. Zwingli went to the battlefield as a chaplain and was slain on Halloween in the year 1531. Once his body was identified, it was burned. The next of the reformers we need to consider is John Calvin. Many historians and theologians alike consider John Calvin the most influential of all of the reformers. And that's because Calvin influenced Western civilization more than either Luther or Zwingli. And he emphasized, he influenced civilization toward his views simply because he systematized them. He took his studies, put them in a systematic format where others could understand them, and where Luther wrote tracts and pamphlets and treatises, he never put any of his writings into a neat system. Zwingli's approach tended to be negative, but despite his emphasis on covenant theology and a spiritualizing of the ordinances, he hardly presented it in systematic form. Calvin, however, considered his theology carefully and wrote in well-turned phrases. However, if you read some of his material in the Institutes of Christian Religion, you'll find out in many respects that Calvin is less Calvinistic than many believe. I know that sounds a little strange, but I'll try to explain that a bit further as we go along. While Luther was German and Zwingli Swiss, Calvin is French. He was born Jean Cauvin in 1509. He grew up in a nobleman's home where he enjoyed numerous advantages. His father, a secretary to the local bishop, enjoyed considerable wealth, and that in turn resulted in educational opportunities for the young John Calvin. He was a brilliant student. Calvin enrolled at the University of Paris at age 14. At 19, he held a master's degree, and he continued to work toward a degree in law. While a student in Paris, he drew much from a cousin. His name was Peter Olivetan, a former Franciscan. Olivetan's defection from his Franciscan order drove young Calvin to Scripture. Why had he made this decision? He met another man named Melchior Voldmar, who taught him Greek. And that in turn influenced Calvin to study the Bible in its original languages. Voldmar also introduced Calvin to Luther's materials that were circulating throughout Europe at the time. And by 1531, Calvin was immersed in Bible study. His theological study called him to obsess over the doctrine of God's holiness and sovereignty. And in time, the doctrine of God's sovereignty became Calvin's fundamental principle. Everything John Calvin taught stems from that one principle, that one fundamental principle. Everything had to fall under the sovereignty of God. His doctrine of predestination, his doctrine of the covenants, or the ordinances, and all of these things all come out of that one fundamental principle. and is the foundation for his entire theological system. Others who influenced Calvin were men like Nicholas Kopp, who was rector at the University of Paris, Guillaume Farel, who was in Switzerland, and he'll run across him as he moves into Switzerland. Nicholas Kopp called for reform while he was at the University of Paris, and Catholic leaders, hearing him speak, drove both Kopp and Calvin to leave Paris. And as he left Paris, he went through Switzerland. Calvin met Guillaume Farel as he fled the city, only to stop in Geneva. Farel sensed Calvin's intellect and encouraged him to stay and become his assistant. Except for a really brief period in Strasbourg, Calvin will spend the rest of his life in Geneva. When he began to come to have some influence in the city, the Genevan magistrates were sympathetic to reform and supported Calvin's efforts to reform the city's religious and political life. Calvin attempted to establish a theocracy, or a community where God's laws determined church and community life. His first efforts failed when his heavy-handed policies led to rebellion and banishment. During the period of banishment, Calvin found himself in Strasbourg, and there he met Martin Bucer, a very important reformer in his own right. Bucer helped Calvin form clearer views on predestination, the liturgy of the church, the presbyterial form of church government, and I'm sure there were many other things as well. However, while Calvin was in Strasbourg, conditions in Geneva were going from bad to worse, and that led the city magistrates to ask Calvin to come back with a promise of a blank check if he were to do so. Once back in Geneva, Calvin revised the church government, placed it under the community and church leadership, and it was kind of a division of responsibility. Preachers and elders safeguarded community morals. They proposed disciplinary measures, and then they turned to the magistrates of the city to carry those things out. He established a secret espionage system, which reported moral and legal violations to the magistrates. And things were pretty rough. Let me put it that way. Things were pretty rough in Geneva. From 1542 to 1546, arrests led to 58 executions and 76 banishments. His views were harsh, and they were very diligently appealed to and held to. Calvin's repressive measures led to all kinds of resistance. Calvin referred to those who opposed his system as libertines. And most of the libertines, however, were simply pantheists or free thinkers, men and women who wanted to think for themselves and live according to their own consciences. Calvin moved quickly to put down any objections. There are three individuals that really serve as examples of how heavy-handed Calvin could be. One of them was Jacques Gruet, who was imprisoned in 1547 for blasphemy and atheism, and after being imprisoned for a time, he was then executed. Calvin also imprisoned Pierre Amiot for failure to attend worship and for the clothes that he wore, the dress in which he appeared in public. But the most famous event involves Michael Servetus. Servetus was a Spanish reformer who was driven out of Spain by the Spanish Inquisition. We haven't talked about that and probably won't spend much time on it. But Servetus was teaching a form of Arianism, thus he was driven out. And when he came to Geneva, he was really not welcomed all that much. Calvin had him arrested, ordered him to recant. When he refused to do so, Calvin saw to it that Michael Servetus was burned at the stake. I want to encourage you to check out The Essence of Calvinism on the course site and on my own site as well. I'm not sure if I'm going to put it up on the course site or not, but it's on my own website, which is christianchronicler.com. Let me repeat that. It's www.christianchronicler.com. That's CHRISTIANCHRONICLER.com. All one word except for the .com, of course. Now, in that material, I present Calvin's salient points along with an evaluation. I think you might find that helpful. All right, this leads us to Henry VIII. And no, I'm not going to sing the song for you. You would really be frightened were I to do that. The English churches always exhibited somewhat of an independent spirit, and it's suggested that English reform began as early as the Magna Carta, and by the 16th century, English monarchs held a strong grip. Parliament met, but were controlled by the royalty. When reform began in earnest, it was more political than religious. Clamor for reform came more from Henry VIII and his marital issues than a desire to reform liturgy and dogma. Henry is an interesting person. He first seems destined for a church career rather than the monarchy. He had the credentials. Church leaders recognized him as a scholarly theologian, well-versed in Scripture. When Luther's writings began circulating in England, Henry wrote a stern rebuttal, earning him the title from the Pope as Defender of the Faith. That's a title that English monarchs even wear today. They claim to be the defender of the faith. And when he ascended the throne after the death of his older brother, he was a thoroughgoing Catholic, and he remained so for over 20 years. Now the story is rather like a soap opera, to tell you the truth. To secure goodwill and monetary support, Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, arranged for the marriage of his son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, and she brought with her a substantial dowry which was desperately needed by the treasury of England. 5 months after the wedding, Arthur died. Unwilling to return the dowry, the king hastily arranged a marriage to his son Henry VIII. Henry was 14 at the time, and Catherine was 8 years his senior. She was 22. Henry initially objected, but agreed to the marriage with the stipulation that he might repudiate it when he comes of age. The Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham, questioned the marriage on the basis of the current understanding of Leviticus 20, verse 21. Well, in spite of all of that, Henry and Catherine became a happily married couple until it became clear she was unable to bear him a son. Henry became desperate to father a son because of England's experience with female rulers, and that experience was not good. Between 1509 and 1514, every child that Catherine conceived was born stillborn or died in infancy. And Henry became convinced God was punishing him for violating Leviticus 20, verse 21. During their marriage, Catherine bore only one child who survived, and that was their daughter Mary. Mary later came to the throne and will be known as Bloody Mary. If Henry and Catherine had a normal life and had been a normal couple, I suppose it's possible their marriage might have lasted. But the desire for a male heir drove Henry to find a mate to bear him one. Henry tried to annul his marriage to Catherine so he could remarry without any kind of stigma from the church. He cited Leviticus 20, verse 21 as grounds, and he sought relief from the Pope. At the time, however, the Pope was caught between a rock and a hard place. Charles V the Holy Roman Emperor and a relative of Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella kind of held him in contempt, so to speak, because of any effort, and the Pope was afraid to make any kind of ruling that would offend either Charles V or Ferdinand and Isabella. He simply could not afford to offend either, and thus he denied Henry's request. At that point, Henry took matters into his own hand. He married a pregnant Anne Boleyn, put Catherine away in a tower, and then once he married Anne Boleyn, however, he found she was unable to bear a viable male heir as well. She did have one surviving offspring. That was a daughter named Elizabeth, who later became Elizabeth I. She did bear a son, Edward, who lived to the age of 15. And he will take the throne after his father's death, since he's the male heir, but he will die very young. Still desperate for a viable male heir, Henry charged Anne with adultery and executed her along with her brother and several others. He then married Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and finally Catherine Parr, all in quick succession, and all but one were either executed or outlived him. Catherine Parr, his last marriage, outlived him. What Henry didn't know, however, is the fact that it is the male who carries the determining gene for a child's gender. There was no way that he could have known in that day that the fault for the continuing failure to bear a male heir was his and not his successive wives. At war with the church, with the Catholic Church, because of his successive divorces and marriages, Henry simply withdrew the English church from papal control. He cut off the flow of annates and fees to the church. He persuaded Parliament to move some legislation through that withdrew the church from Catholicism. An act of succession in March of 1534 declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid, and then approved his marriage to Anne Boleyn. And 7 months later, after that, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, which confirmed Henry's control of both church and state. At that point, all of the bishops were required to accept royal authority without question. English monasteries were subsequently closed and property confiscated. By the time I've got to slow myself down here. By the time the confiscation ended, the king's spoils totaled about $140 million. And again, that was really needed by the English treasury. In the years following England's religious fortunes, let me restate that. In the years following, England's religious fortunes shifted from a form of Protestantism to Catholicism and back again. It wasn't until Elizabeth came to the throne with much drama that England became decidedly Protestant. Actions toward Catholics depended on who occupied the English throne, but Protestantism remained firmly in control of the church in England. The English church adopted the 39 Articles, the statement of faith that still declares the faith of England. And basically the 39 Articles were rooted in Calvinism. They did, however, keep Catholic liturgy and vestments and parish structure. And that's still pretty much true today. In the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, there's high church and low church. The high church is much more ritualistic, much more liturgical, much more Catholic in its feel. The low church is far more Protestant and less ritualistic, less based in liturgy, but both still remain very much active. And many Anglicans even accept the Pope as the head of the church. It's just simply that they don't accept his authority over those of the Bishop of Canterbury. There's a lot more that we could say about England as a reform movement, and a lot of that's going to continue on into the colonial period. There are going to be revolutions and other things that will affect how Protestantism and Catholicism are viewed in England. And we may touch on some of that in our next lecture. Well, let me deal for a few minutes with the spread of Calvinism, because it proved to be the most energetic of all reform efforts. Calvinism encouraged an evangelistic fervor that was far greater than all of the others combined. They trained preachers, sent them out from Geneva to the rest of Europe, and these preachers permeated the religious culture of the rest of Europe and took Calvin's systematized theology into many of these denominations. And in fact, almost every denomination, Protestant or otherwise, even yet today, exhibits many of the characteristics and influence of John Calvin. Let's talk first about reform in France. Calvinism in France won a number of converts from the growing bourgeoisie or middle class. And as reform spread throughout the nation, the church and the monarchy responded with policies designed to exterminate every Protestant and to do away with all of their churches and all of their literature. Calvinism's oppressive nature did not appeal to peasants, and university intellectuals influenced those in the middle class, at least those who did not respond to Calvin's appeal. The spread of French Protestantism, however, eventually brought civil war in 1562. The constant fighting then led to the Edict of January from the king and from the Estates General. The Edict of January guaranteed the Huguenots, or French Protestants, the right to worship in specified cities. They set aside about 10, as I remember it, they set aside about 10 cities in France where the French Protestants could worship and without any hesitation. But Protestants and Catholics alike violated the edict, and that just simply led to additional conflict. In 1598, Henry IV of France issued the Edict of Nantes, that's Nates, Nantes, which officially recognized Protestantism and permitted worship where churches already existed. They weren't just to proselyte, they weren't to go out and evangelize, but they could worship freely in places where there were already churches. But in the early 1600s, the monarchy renewed efforts to force a unified religion on the French people. Many of the monarchs believed that one nation required one king and one religion. And therefore, anyone who had some kind of viewpoint or denominational perspective, that's using the word loosely, would be pressured to return to Catholicism as it was the official religion as accepted by the monarchy. So in 1685, the monarchy pressured the Huguenots to convert, and this led to a definite ultimatum where the Huguenots were either to convert or leave. And the French Protestants left en masse. Over 250,000 of France's best citizens left. According to some estimates, there were 9,000 sailors, there were 12,000 veteran soldiers, and 600 officers, and thousands upon thousands of craftsmen. In fact, many of the greatest craftsmen left for Bavaria and formed many of those fine crafts and industries that are known for their fine work out of Bavaria. Others went to America, some up into France, some down into South America, and some into Florida for a while. But then there was also next the Reform in Scotland that we need to talk about. Calvinism spread to Scotland because both Scotland and France were military allies. They had a common enemy. That enemy was England. And there were a lot of tensions between the Scots and the French. The linguistic and cultural differences tended to create issues, but their common animosity toward England kept them together. Catholics, of course, in Scotland with French sympathies initially resisted any kind of effort at reform. But basically what the Scots needed was a strong figure to ignite the fire of reform. And John Knox provided the match to light the flames. Knox was born in Haddington, located east of Edinburgh. He was trained for the priesthood, but he became a disciple of a staunch Calvinist named George Wishart. He participated in a brief rebellion, was arrested, and spent 19 months as a galley slave as a result. He later escaped, became a Protestant minister in England. At one point he had gone to Geneva where he met John Calvin, and then after that returned to Scotland to organize Reformed churches. And he was very successful. He successfully evangelized influential nobles who in turn helped him spread reform. But reform in Scotland took a doctrinal path along Calvinistic lines, as you might expect. Churches established a Presbyterian government, which foreshadowed modern American Presbyterianism. It also influenced Puritanism and independency. In England, a little later, there's a movement that is simply labeled independence, and that independent movement is basically Congregationalism. We need to talk for a few minutes about reform in the Netherlands. The spread of Calvinism into the Low Countries is a puzzle, since Spain controlled the Low Countries at that time. Significantly, reform efforts in the Netherlands came at a time when the Low Countries were struggling for political independence from Spain. The Dutch eagerly read Luther's writings, but ultimately rejected them due to the influence of Desiderius Erasmus, who was the famous humanist reformer born in Rotterdam. Calvinism gained influence when William of Orange converted to Protestantism in 1573, and the Netherlands Church and the people united behind him. During the struggle for independence, the Dutch Reformed Church took shape, adopted a Presbyterian form of government, and accepted two Calvinistic statements of faith as their creed. During the 1600s, the Dutch Reformed Church divided over a difference over when God had elected to save the lost. If you study Calvinism, you will come to understand that when God created the heavens and the earth, at some point, when he considered the creation of humanity, he understood what would happen, that Adam would sin and fall away. And so at some point, God would determine those whom he would save and those whom he would condemn to being lost. And these two particular views that arose are simply debates over the timing of election. One is supralapsarianism and the other infralapsarianism. The first is the idea that God elected the saved prior to creation. In other words, God already had in mind every single person who would ever live on the planet, And he chose those, from that number of people that he foreknew, he would determine those who would be saved and those who would be lost. Yeah, those who would be among the elect and those who would be among the condemned. Infralapsarianism taught that God's election would come after the creation. So God would create the universe, create the planet, place Adam and Eve on the planet, and then at some point in there, whether before the creation of Adam and Eve or immediately after Adam's sin, he would then determine for all the time of human existence those whom he would save and those whom he would those whom he would condemn. Among those, there were some who said the whole idea is goofy. And these were called remonstrants. And among the remonstrants was a man by the name of Jacob Arminius. And Arminius denied all kinds of things that John Calvin had taught. He denied the bondage of the will. He denied predestination. He believed that man was a free moral agent. And overall, Arminianism rejected unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the strict Calvinistic form of preservation of the saints. Now, all of those things will be discussed on that sheet that I told you about earlier when it looks at the basics of Calvinism. The solution to all of this came in 1618, and then it kind of carried over into 1619 at the Synod of Dort. The Synod of Dort affirmed strict Calvinism, and yet Arminianism held its own and continued to infiltrate Holland and seemed to spread right with Calvinism as it spread. All right, there's one other area here we need to look at for a few minutes, and this is the Catholic counter-revolution. Because the Catholics actually were beginning some reform efforts prior to the time of Luther's challenge. And there were some within the Catholic Church who had been calling for reform. But once the Reformation started, Catholics moved very quickly to answer the reform impulse with efforts of their own to correct some of the abuses, to increase education for the clergy, to encourage greater pastoral oversight, for example. I know that a lot of historians and a lot of people think Catholics were merely reacting to the reforms of Luther and Zwingli and Calvin and others. But the Catholic Church, as I mentioned earlier, had long recognized the necessity of reform. And so Catholics objected to the papal moral and financial abuse. They were trying to reform some of the organizational structures, but most of that was left unchanged. Emperor Charles V wanted to convene a council specifically charged with enacting reform in the hope that it would bring about the restoration of relationships between Protestants and the Catholics, the Protestants being disaffected from Catholicism, and bring all of them back into one fold. But the popes refused to respond to any of Charles V's call for council because they feared that if they actually allowed a council to meet, that they would lose power, that they would lose their influence, and it would come back around much like it had been during the period of the councils after the divided papacy. But ultimately, the Pope caved in, and allowed the Fifth Lateran Council to convene in 1512. Now that's actually 5 years before Luther nails his challenge for debate on the Wittenberg chapel door. But the council, during its sessions, enacted a few reforms on paper, but in reality they accomplished little. Several years later, the Council of Trent was called, and that council met sporadically between 1545 in 1563, and it was a very successful council. It established most current Catholic doctrine, set aside funds to educate the clergy, ordered the clergy to preach the gospel, and prohibited monks from preaching without a license. The council went on to reform monastic moral life, commanded the clergy to practice stewardship and thrift. The council determined that clergymen could no longer keep concubines and that any illegitimate sons that were born to them were prohibited from holding church offices. In doctrinal matters, the council pronounced the apocryphal books as scripture, stated that baptism removed the sin of Adam's sin, or I should maybe say the stain of Adam's sin, but little else, and they condemned Calvin's doctrine of predestination, although they did adopt one somewhat similar. The church also recognized tradition as being equal with Scripture. They affirmed the Vulgate, that's Jerome's translation into Latin. They affirmed the Vulgate as the only authorized Bible translation, and they issued the first list of approved and prohibited books. Many books will carry a labeling such as nihil obstat, which means this is not accepted. You can't read this. There are books that Catholics will be forbidden to read. During this period, the period of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, the Society of Jesus formed as an outstanding expression of Catholic reform. This was begun by Ignatius Loyola. He was a former Spanish soldier of fortune. He had been wounded in battle, and as he was healing in hospital, he began to read religious books, and he founded the Jesuit order as a reforming society. And he did that once he was healed up from his injuries and went to the University of Paris for study. And his idea was kind of a romantic idea. He liked to read romantic novels at the time. And so rather than serving the king and queen of France, he would now turn to serving the king and queen of heaven. And he was no longer able to serve in the military and because of his wounds, but now he could turn his whole attention to the faith, to the Catholic Church, and to the spreading of Catholicism. As I mentioned earlier, after his release from hospital, he enrolled at the University of Paris. He was older than most of the students. He felt a little out of place. His devotion and leadership, however, were noted and admired by many of the students, and that led to a group who formed around him. And in this group was a man named Francis Xavier. And that group, along with Francis Xavier, became the nucleus of the Jesuit order. Loyola's Society of Jesus got papal support and approval in 1540. It was placed under direct papal supervision. The Jesuits do not answer to any archbishop or bishop. They answer directly to the papacy. And when Protestant reform began to spread throughout Europe, the Jesuits became the church's militia, tasked with the responsibility of recovering Europe from this Protestant heresy. There were a number of innovations that Loyola established and those in turn made the Jesuit order highly effective. He did away with a number of medieval practices that you would find in most of the monasteries and monastic orders of the period. He discarded the habits or clothing worn by the mendicant orders. He completely restructured the liturgy observed in their worship. He abandoned any pretense of democratic means of selecting leadership within the order and organized the Jesuits into a militaristic society. He introduced very simple vows, which allowed a recruit to abandon. If he got involved and found out it was not his style, he could leave the order just by announcing that he wished to do so. In actuality, the Jesuits were successful by any standard. And when Loyola died in 1556, there were over 1,000 Jesuit missionaries working throughout the world. The 1991 movie Black Robe tells the story of Jesuit work among the wilderness of Quebec in the 17th century. The movie received an R rating for its violence and its sensuality. There's one scene in the movie where there's a little bit of nudity, but in our own culture today, most people wouldn't think much about it because the movies have gotten to be so immoral in many cases. But I saw the movie because I wanted to see how accurate its portrayal was, and as nearly as I could find out, it was an accurate portrayal of Jesuit work and the hardship and the sufferings they incurred. There's another movie that also talks about Jesuit missionary work. It's in a new movie that's just out right now. I'm doing this lecture in February of 2017, and this movie is just now coming out. It's called Silence, and it portrays the story of James Martin, who was a Jesuit, James Martin, who was a Jesuit, who was actually a consultant to make the movie, and says that the movie's director was inspired by the Holy Spirit. Well, I don't know about that, but I haven't seen it yet, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it. It looks like it looks like it may be somewhat violent because it carries an R rating. It's a movie that gives a picture of Jesuit work in Japan and the horror of persecution that they faced there. And I can tell you just from my historical studies that the Jesuit work was very successful in Japan in the beginning, and then the Catholic, or rather the Japanese leadership turned against them, and the persecution they institute was extremely horrible. Jesuits also worked to reclaim portions of Germany for Catholicism. They followed the conquistadors to America, establishing church schools and churches as well. But Spain sold out the Jesuit mission to the Portuguese, and the Portuguese were more prone to enslaving Native Americans than converting them. There is another movie called Mission. It's filmed in 1986 that goes into the story. I haven't seen that movie, but I understand that it may or may, well, I don't really know whether it's accurate or not. I haven't seen it, but I just want you to know that it's available. Well, that concludes this lecture. Has been a look at the late Middle Ages and the period of Reformation. In next week, or next presentation, I should say, I'll take you from the discovery of the New World through the colonial period to the end of the 18th century.